The door of the diner burst open so hard that the bell above it nearly flew off its hook. Rain poured in behind a tall man whose boots left thick trails of mud across the floor. Mira Callahan had mopped only 20 minutes earlier. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone. He walked straight to the back booth, sat down, and stared at the wall, as if the world outside was still chasing him. Mira set down the coffee pot she was holding, and crossed her arms. She had run this diner for 6 years, through storms, through slow winters, through strangers who thought they could walk in and act however they pleased. She was not about to let one more person track filth across her clean floor without a word. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward him. "Do you see what you just did to my floor?" The man finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, gray, and tired, in a way that did not match his broad shoulders, or the confidence in his posture. Water dripped from his dark hair onto the table. "I need a moment," he said quietly. "That is all." "You can have a moment after you wipe your boots," Mira said. "I just cleaned that floor. Do you know how long it took me to get the coffee stains out from this morning?" A young couple in the corner booth stopped eating to watch. An old man at the counter lowered his newspaper. Nobody in this town spoke to strangers that way, especially not strangers who looked like they had just walked out of a storm carrying trouble on their backs. But Mira did not know who he was, and even if she had known, it likely would not have changed much. She cared about her diner. She cared about things being right. The man studied her for a long moment. There was something almost bewildered in his expression, as if nobody had spoken to him like this in a very long time. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted. "You are upset about the floor," he said, not quite believing it. "I am upset about the floor," Mira confirmed. "This is a diner, not a barn." Outside, 2 men in dark jackets stood near a black truck parked crookedly against the curb, watching the door with tense expressions. One of them started forward, ready to step inside, but the taller man near him grabbed his arm and shook his head. They stayed where they were, watching through the rain-streaked window. Mira did not know it, but those 2 men were his personal guards, and neither of them had ever seen anyone speak to Kellen Draven the way she just had. Not once in all their years serving him. People bowed. People stepped aside. People lowered their eyes and spoke carefully, choosing every word as if it might be their last. Nobody scolded him about a floor. "I apologize," Kellen said, and he meant it, though the words felt strange in his mouth. "I was not thinking about the floor." "Well, start thinking about it," Mira said, though her voice had softened slightly, now that he was not fighting her. She grabbed a rag from behind the counter and tossed a spare pair of shoe covers onto the table in front of him, the kind she kept for the delivery drivers who tracked in mud from the loading dock. "Put those on if you plan to stay. And can I get you something? Coffee, maybe. You look like you could use it." Kellen looked at the shoe covers, then at her, then let out a short laugh, quiet and surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. "Coffee would be good," he said. "Thank you." Mira nodded and walked away, already reaching for a clean mug. She did not see the way Kellen watched her go, or the way his shoulders, tense from a long and difficult night, eased just slightly for the first time in hours. The storm outside continued to rage, rattling the windows and hissing against the tin roof. Kellen had come from the eastern ridge, where a dispute along the border of his territory had turned tense enough that he had ridden through the night without his usual escort of a dozen guards, choosing to travel light and fast with only Elias and one other. It had been a long few months of pressure from every direction, council meetings that dragged past midnight, boundary disputes that threatened to boil over, and a growing sense that he was more of a symbol to his people than a person. Somewhere in the last year, Kellen Draven had stopped being someone people spoke to honestly. He had become someone people managed. The tired diner in this quiet human town had not been his destination. He had simply seen the lights through the rain, and needed somewhere to sit for a few minutes before continuing on. He had expected silence, maybe a curious glance from a waitress too polite to ask questions. He had not expected to be scolded about mud. Mira returned with the coffee and set it down in front of him, along with a small plate of pie she had not been asked for. "On the house," she said. "You looked like you needed it more than you needed to be yelled at, but the yelling came first, because frankly, that floor took forever." "I noticed," Kellen said, and there was warmth in his voice now, something unfamiliar and welcome. "It smells wonderful. It's apple. My grandmother's recipe." Mira wiped her hands on her apron and studied him for a moment. Up close, She could see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the kind that came from more than just a long drive. Rough night? You could say that, Kellen replied. Well, you're safe here, Mira said simply. And then, because it was late, and she still had tables to wipe down, she turned and went back to work, leaving him with his coffee, and his pie, and the quiet hum of the diner around him. Kellen sat there for nearly an hour. He watched Mira move between tables, watched her laugh with the old man at the counter, watched her scold a teenager for putting his feet on the booth seat with the exact same tone she had used on him, unimpressed and entirely without fear. It struck him, somewhere in that hour, that this was the first time in longer than he could remember that someone had treated him as simply a man who had made a mess, rather than as the alpha king of the Ashwood pack. When he finally stood to leave, he pulled out far more money than the meal cost and set it beneath the saucer. For the floor, he said. That's too much, Mira said, glancing at the bills. Consider it payment for the lesson, Kellen replied, and before she could argue, he was already walking toward the door. He paused there, hand on the frame, and looked back at her one more time. Thank you, for the coffee, and the honesty. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain, leaving Mira standing there with a strange, unplaceable feeling settling in her chest, the kind you get when you sense something important has happened, even if you cannot yet say what. Outside, Elias jogged to meet him, relief plain on his face. You were in there a long time, Elias said. We were about to come in and check on you. I'm fine, Kellen said, glancing back once more at the glowing windows of the diner. Better than fine, actually. Elias frowned, studying his king's face in the dim light of the street lamp. He had known Kellen since they were boys running through the northern woods together, long before either of them carried the weight they carried now. He knew every version of Kellen's expressions, the diplomatic mask he wore in council, the guarded calm he wore in negotiations, the quiet grief he carried after his father's death 2 years ago. This expression, though, was new, lighter, almost boyish. What happened in there? Elias asked. I got scolded, Kellen said, and he was smiling now, a real smile, the kind Elias had not seen in longer than he wanted to admit. About mud, on the floor. Elias blinked. You got scolded, by a human woman, about mud. I did. And you're smiling about it. I am, Kellen said, climbing into the truck. Drive, Elias. We have a long way back. Elias got in beside him, still shaking his head slightly, but he did not ask any more questions, not yet. He simply started the engine and pulled away from the curb, glancing once more in the mirror at the little diner glowing warmly against the storm, wondering what exactly had happened inside those walls, and sensing, in some quiet corner of his mind, that things were about to change. The truck merged onto the main road, tires hissing against the wet pavement, and within minutes, the lights of the town had faded behind them, swallowed by the dark countryside and the endless curtain of rain. Kellen stared out the window, replaying the conversation in his mind, the sharpness in her voice, the way she had not hesitated for even a second before telling him off. Nobody spoke to him like that, not his advisors, who chose their words as if walking across ice, not the council members, who agreed with nearly everything he said out of respect or fear or both, not even Elias, most of the time, though Elias came closer than most. It had been refreshing in a way Kellen could not fully explain, even to himself. For years, his life had been built around control, strategy, and the careful management of a pack that depended on him for stability. Every conversation carried weight. Every decision rippled outward into consequences he had to consider before he even opened his mouth. But in that diner, for 1 hour, none of that had mattered. He had simply been a man who tracked mud across a clean floor, and the woman who owned that floor had told him so, plainly and without fear. He thought about her laugh, quick and unguarded, and the way she had teased the teenager at the counter, with the same easy confidence she had used on him. He thought about the pie, still warm, the kind gesture hidden beneath her scolding. There had been no calculation in her, no attempt to please him or read what he wanted to hear. She had simply been herself, entirely and without apology, and something about that honesty had settled into him like a held breath finally released. By the time the truck reached the outer gates of Ashwood territory, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and the guards at the checkpoint straightened at the sight of the vehicle, bowing their heads as it passed. Kellen barely noticed them. His mind was still back in that small diner, in the warm glow of the lights, in the sound of a woman's voice telling him, quite plainly, that he had made a mess. He did not know it yet, but he would be back. Soon. And often. And nothing about his carefully managed life would ever be quite the same again. Elias glanced sideways at him one more time, as they pulled up the long drive toward the manor house, its windows lit despite the late hour, staff still awake and waiting for their king's return. "You're already planning to go back," Elias said. It was not a question. Kellen did not answer right away. He simply looked out at the manor rising ahead of them, grand and familiar and somehow, in that moment, less like home than the small, warm diner he had just left behind. "Maybe," he finally said, and the ghost of that same unfamiliar smile touched his lips again. "We'll see." Elias parked the truck and killed the engine, letting the silence settle between them for a moment before he spoke again, quieter this time, almost to himself. "I haven't seen you smile like that in 2 years," he said. Kellen turned to look at him, and for once, he did not have a careful, measured answer ready. He simply nodded, once, and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving Elias sitting there in the driver's seat, watching his king walk toward the manor with a lightness in his step that had not been there in a very long time. Inside the manor, the staff greeted him with the usual formalities, bows and careful questions about the border dispute, about his safety during the storm, about what he needed before retiring for the night. Kellen answered each one briefly, his mind still elsewhere, and made his way to his study, where a stack of reports waited for him on the desk, untouched since that morning. He sat down, intending to work through them before sleep, but found his attention drifting instead to the memory of a small diner, glowing warm against the rain, and a woman with sharp eyes and an apron dusted with flour, who had looked at the most powerful man in the region and told him, without a hint of fear, that he had dirtied her floor. He picked up his pen, set it back down, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to simply sit with the strange, unfamiliar warmth of the evening, before duty called him back to the endless weight of his crown. Outside, the storm continued to pass over the land, moving east toward the border he had left behind, carrying with it the last of the tension from that difficult night. But something had shifted in Kellen Draven, something small and quiet, and though he did not yet understand its full shape, he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would find his way back to that diner again. Soon. 3 days later, the bell above the diner door rang again, and Mira looked up from the register to see the same tall stranger standing in the doorway, this time in dry clothes, his boots noticeably clean. "I wiped them off outside," he said, before she could speak. "I checked twice." Mira let out a short laugh, surprised at how easily it came. "Progress," she said. "Sit anywhere you like." He chose the same back booth as before. Mira brought him coffee without being asked, and lingered a moment longer than she usually did with strangers. "You're back," she said. "I am," Kellen replied. "The pie was excellent. I thought about it more than I probably should have." "That's the nicest thing anyone said about my grandmother's recipe in months," Mira said. "I'll get you a slice." He came back 2 days after that, and again the following week, always in the evening, always choosing the same booth, always ordering coffee and pie, and, eventually, whatever the special happened to be that night. Mira began to notice the rhythm of his visits before she fully admitted to herself that she was noticing them at all. She found herself glancing at the door around closing time, and when he walked in, something in her chest would ease, quiet and unremarkable, the way a familiar song settles a room. He never explained who he was, and she never asked, not directly. There was an easy comfort in not knowing, in treating him simply as a man who liked pie and clean floors and, apparently, her company. He told her his name was Kellen. He asked about her grandmother, about the diner, about the recipes taped inside the old cookbook she kept behind the counter. He listened in a way that felt unusual, patient and unhurried, as if her stories about small-town gossip and stubborn delivery trucks were genuinely worth his attention. "You run this whole place by yourself?" he asked one evening, watching her flip a sign from open to closed, as the last customer wandered out into the night. "Mostly. I've got Nora who helps a few nights a week, and my cousin comes by on weekends when things get busy. But yes, mostly by myself." Mira wiped down the counter, glancing at him. "Why do you ask?" "It's impressive. Kellen said simply. Building something and keeping it running, day after day, without anyone telling you how. Mira paused, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. That's a strange thing to find impressive. Is it? Kellen tilted his head. I find it rare. Most people I know have things handed to them, or built by someone else, long before they arrived. You made this. There was something in the way he said it, something that suggested he was speaking from more experience than she understood. But Mira let it pass, filing it away as one more small mystery about the quiet man who kept returning to her diner. What Mira did not know was the effect her presence was having far beyond the walls of that small building. Back at the manor, the change in Kellen had not gone unnoticed. He arrived at council meetings less tense, less quick to snap at delays or disagreements. He laughed more easily with his staff. He had even begun taking his evening meal earlier than usual, always finding some excuse to be free by the time the sun began to set. Elias noticed first, of course. He always noticed first. You've been going to that diner every week, Elias said one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe of Kellen's study, as his king reviewed a stack of trade agreements. I have, Kellen admitted, not looking up. For coffee and pie. Among other things. Elias crossed his arms, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. You do realize the guards talk. They've started calling it your standing appointment. Kellen finally looked up, unbothered. Let them talk. It's the first appointment I've kept in years that I actually look forward to. Elias studied him for a long moment, weighing something in his mind before he spoke again. Does she know who you are? No, Kellen said, and I'd like to keep it that way, for now. Kellen, I know what you're going to say. Kellen set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, meeting his friend's eyes. I know the risks. I know the council would have concerns if they knew where I was spending my evenings. But Elias, for the first time in longer than I can remember, someone looks at me and sees a man, not a title. I'm not ready to give that up. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering this. He had watched Kellen grow into the crown far too young, after his father's sudden death had thrust the full weight of leadership onto shoulders that were, in truth, still those of a young man learning who he wanted to be. He had watched the isolation settle over Kellen slowly, the way advisors stopped speaking freely, the way even old friends began weighing their words before offering opinions, the way every relationship in his life had quietly reorganized itself around his position, rather than his person. Just be careful, Elias finally said. Not everyone in the council will see it the way I do. I know, Kellen said quietly. I'll be careful. But even as he said it, some part of him already suspected that caution would not be enough to keep this new, fragile happiness hidden forever. The world he ruled did not tend to leave good things quiet for long. Meanwhile, in the diner, Mira had begun looking forward to the evenings, in a way she had not expected. She told herself it was simple friendship, the kind that grew naturally between a shopkeeper and a regular customer, nothing more complicated than that. But she noticed the small things anyway, the way Kellen always thanked her by name, the careful attention he paid when she spoke, as though her words mattered more than most people's did, the quiet strength beneath his calm exterior, visible in brief flashes, like a shadow of something larger than the man sitting across from her. One evening, after the last customer had left and the rain had returned, softer this time, tapping gently against the windows, Kellen lingered longer than usual. Mira poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him, something she had never done with a customer before. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. You never talk about your work, or where you're from, or really anything about your life outside this booth. Mira wrapped her hands around her mug, studying him. I'm not trying to pry. I just realized I know almost nothing about you, and yet somehow it doesn't bother me the way it probably should. Kellen considered his answer carefully, weighing the truth against the fragile comfort of the moment. My work is complicated, he said finally, and demanding, in ways that are hard to explain. When I'm here, with you, I don't have to be any of that. I can just be a man who likes pie and clean floors. Mira smiled slightly, though something in his tone made her pause. That sounds heavy, whatever it is you're carrying. It can be, Kellen admitted, but it feels lighter lately. Because of the pie? Because of the company, he said, and the honesty in his voice caught Mira off guard, settling somewhere warm and unfamiliar in her chest. They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, listening to the rain, the diner quiet around them except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter. Mira did not press him further. She sensed, somehow, that whatever he carried was not hers to demand answers about, not yet, and there was a strange peace in simply letting the mystery remain, in trusting that the man in front of her, whoever he truly was beneath the quiet calm, was someone worth knowing, regardless of the answers. Neither of them could have known how quickly that peace would be tested, or how much would change once the truth she was not asking for finally found its way to her anyway. For now, in the warm glow of the diner, with rain tapping gently against the glass, they simply sat together, two people who had somehow found something rare in each other, unaware of the storm still gathering far beyond the walls that sheltered them. Weeks passed, and the visits became something close to a routine, though neither Mira nor Kellen called it that out loud. He came 3 or 4 evenings a week now, always near closing time, always leaving his guards waiting outside, where Mira assumed they were simply friends or drivers, never once suspecting the truth of who they protected. Nora, who worked the counter on busy nights, had started teasing Mira about him without mercy. "He's here again," Nora whispered one evening, nudging Mira as Kellen walked through the door, shaking rain from his jacket. "That's 4 nights this week." "He likes the pie," Mira said, trying and failing to sound unaffected. "Sure he does," Nora said, grinning. "The pie has very broad shoulders and excellent posture." Mira swatted her with a dish towel and went to greet him, ignoring the warmth rising in her cheeks. Whatever this was between them, she was not ready to name it, not yet, though the town had already begun to notice. Small towns rarely missed anything for long, and the sight of a well-dressed, quietly powerful stranger, returning again and again to the same diner, had not escaped the attention of the regulars who gathered each morning at the counter to trade gossip along with their coffee. "He's got the look of someone important," old Mr. Ferris said one morning, watching Mira wipe down the counter. "Mark my words, man like that doesn't spend every evening in a diner in a town this small, unless something's pulled him here." "He's just a customer," Mira said, though even she was beginning to doubt the simplicity of that explanation. The town's curiosity aside, Mira found herself learning more about Kellen with each visit, even if the pieces never quite formed a complete picture. She learned he had lost his father 2 years earlier, and that the loss still sat heavy behind his eyes when he spoke of it, brief and guarded. She learned he loved the quiet of early mornings, the kind before anyone else was awake, because it was the only time his mind felt fully his own. She learned he had a dry sense of humor that emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, as though he had to remember how to use it. In turn, she found herself sharing things she rarely spoke of, the long nights after her grandmother passed and left her the diner, the fear of failing something that had meant so much to someone she loved, the quiet loneliness of running a business alone in a town where everyone knew her but few truly saw her. Kellen listened to all of it with the same careful attention he gave everything else, and slowly, without either of them fully noticing the shift, the space between them began to close. One evening, as autumn settled fully over the town and the trees outside turned gold and copper, Mira found herself teaching Kellen how to make her grandmother's pie crust, the two of them standing behind the counter after closing, flour dusting the countertop between them. "You're doing it wrong," she said, watching him press the dough too firmly with his palms. "Gentle. You're not wrestling it." "I don't know how to be gentle with dough," Kellen admitted, glancing at his flour-covered hands with something close to bewilderment. "This might be beyond my skills." "Everything is beyond your skills the first time you try it," Mira said, stepping closer to adjust his grip, her hands briefly covering his. "Like this, see?" For a moment, neither of them moved, the small kitchen quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator, and the sound of rain beginning again outside. Kellen looked down at her hands over his, then up at her face, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable, warm, and a little frightening in its honesty. Mira stepped back first, clearing her throat and reaching for a towel to wipe the flour from her hands. "You're getting better," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I have a good teacher," Kellen replied, and the words carried more weight than either of them fully acknowledged aloud. That night, after he left, Mira stood behind the counter for a long time, staring at the closed door, replaying the moment in her mind. She had not expected to feel this way about anyone again, not after the last relationship that had ended in quiet disappointment 2 years earlier. A man who had never understood why the diner mattered so much to her, who had wanted her to sell it and move somewhere with more opportunity. She had told herself she was fine alone, that the diner and her small, steady life were enough. But something about Kellen made her question that certainty, made her wonder if she had simply been protecting herself from wanting more. Back at the manor, Kellen faced a similar reckoning. He sat in his study long after midnight, staring at the reports he was supposed to be reviewing, his mind entirely elsewhere. Elias found him there, still awake. The candle burned low. "You should be asleep," Elias said, setting a folder on the desk. "I know," Kellen replied, though he made no move to close the reports or head to bed. Elias studied him for a moment, noting the distant, thoughtful expression on his friend's face. "This is more than pie and clean floors now, isn't it?" Kellen did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain, an unfamiliar tone for a man who commanded an entire pack with steady confidence. "I think it might be," he admitted. "I haven't felt like this in a long time, maybe ever." "And you still haven't told her who you are?" "No." Kellen, Elias sat down across from him, his expression serious now. "The longer this goes on, the harder that conversation becomes. You know that. And if the council finds out before she does, if this becomes political, before it becomes personal." "I know," Kellen said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. "I know the risk. I'm not blind to it, but every time I try to imagine telling her, I worry it changes everything. Right now, she doesn't see the crown, she sees me. I don't know how to explain what that means to someone who has never had it any other way." Elias sighed, leaning back in his chair. He understood the temptation, more than he let on. He had watched his friend disappear slowly under the weight of leadership for 2 years, watched the light in him dim beneath endless obligations and careful diplomacy. If this woman had brought some of that light back, Elias was reluctant to be the one demanding he extinguish it too soon. "Just don't wait too long," Elias said finally. "Secrets like this don't stay secrets forever. Not in our world." Kellen nodded slowly, the weight of the warning settling over him even as he tried to push it aside. He thought of Mira's hands over his, gentle and sure, guiding him through something as simple as pie crust, with the same patience she seemed to bring to everything in her life. He thought of the warmth in the diner, the easy laughter, the quiet honesty that made him feel, for the first time in years, like a person rather than a position. He was not ready to give that up, not yet, even as some quiet, cautious part of him understood that the longer he waited, the more painful the reckoning would eventually be, for both of them. Outside, the rain continued through the night, steady and unhurried, much like the two lives quietly drawing closer together, unaware of how soon the storm building far beyond their control would finally break. In the great hall of Ashwood Manor, the council gathered for its monthly session, a room of long tables and older faces, wolves, who had served the pack for decades, and expected their opinions to carry weight. Among them sat Ronan Voss, Kellen's cousin, a sharp-featured man with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. Ronan had grown up alongside Kellen, close enough in age and lineage that Whispers had once wondered whether the crown might pass to him instead. It had not, and though Ronan had always spoken warmly of his cousin in public, there were those, Elias among them, who suspected the old disappointment had never fully faded. "The king has been distracted these past months," Ronan said smoothly, addressing the council rather than Elias directly, though his eyes flicked toward him more than once. "Missing morning briefings, leaving evening councils early. I only raise it out of concern for the pack's stability." "He has been more present, not less," Elias said evenly, though a note of warning colored his voice. "Whatever business occupies his evenings has not affected his judgment." "Business," Ronan repeated, tasting the word carefully. "Is that what we're calling it?" A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the older council members. Grace, the eldest among them, and one of the few whose opinion Kellen genuinely valued, raised a hand for silence. "Speak plainly, Ronan, or not at all," she said. "This council has no patience for insinuation." Ronan inclined his head respectfully, though the faint smile never left his face. "Of course. I only mean to say that our king's happiness matters to all of us, and if something, or someone, has captured his attention, the council deserves to understand who that might be. For the sake of the pack's future, if nothing else." The words hung in the air, deliberately vague, deliberately dangerous. Elias felt his jaw tighten but said nothing further, unwilling to give Ronan the satisfaction of a reaction. He had suspected for weeks that Ronan was watching Kellen's movements more closely than usual, and this confirmed it. Somehow, word had begun to travel. Quiet murmurs among the staff about the king's frequent evening absences, about the direction his truck was seen driving each time he left the manor. After the council session ended, Ronan lingered in the hall, watching the others file out, before approaching one of the younger guards who had occasionally accompanied Kellen on his evening trips. "Long drive out to the human town again last night?" Ronan asked casually, leaning against the wall with practiced ease. The young guard, unaccustomed to being addressed directly by a member of the royal family, hesitated before answering. "The king asked for privacy regarding his evening business, sir." "Of course he did," Ronan said smoothly. "I'm not asking you to break his confidence. I only wondered how the roads were, given the rain. You must have passed through that small town near the eastern crossing. Callahan's, isn't it? The diner there?" The guard's brief flicker of surprise was answer enough. Ronan smiled, satisfied, and let the young wolf continue on his way without further pressing. He had what he needed for now. Later that evening, in the privacy of his own quarters, Ronan sat by the fire with a glass of wine, turning the information over carefully in his mind. A human woman, a diner owner. It explained the king's distraction, his sudden lightness, the missed briefings that had begun to concern even the most patient members of the council. It was, Ronan thought, both an opportunity and a threat, depending on how carefully it was managed. He had no particular animosity toward humans. Not truly, though many in the older generations of the pack still viewed such connections with suspicion, remnants of a time when the divide between wolf and human communities had been far less peaceful than it was now. But more than any prejudice, Ronan understood politics, understood how quickly a king's personal affections could destabilize carefully balanced alliances, especially if certain neighboring packs learned that Ashwood's leader had grown attached to someone entirely outside the traditional structures of pack loyalty and strategic marriage. It was not that Ronan wished Kellen harm, not exactly, but he had spent 2 years watching his cousin rule with careful precision, admired by the council, respected by neighboring packs, and secretly, quietly, Ronan had wondered what might happen if that precision faltered even slightly. A crack, even a small one, could open doors that had long seemed permanently closed. He began making quiet inquiries the following week, careful and unhurried, the way a patient hunter tracks prey without alerting it to the danger closing in. He learned about the diner, about Mira Callahan, about her grandmother who had once run the same establishment, about the quiet, unremarkable life she led in a town most of the pack had never bothered to notice. There was nothing scandalous in what he found, nothing he could immediately use, but Ronan was patient. He filed the information away, waiting for the right moment, confident that one would eventually present itself. Meanwhile, unaware of the quiet storm gathering around him, Kellen continued his evening visits, each one drawing him closer to Mira, each one making the eventual truth of his identity feel like a heavier burden to finally set down. Elias watched the growing tension in the council with mounting unease, torn between his loyalty to his friend's happiness and his responsibility to warn him of the danger circling closer with each passing week. "Ronan is asking questions," Elias said finally, catching Kellen alone in the study one evening before he left for the diner. "About your evenings. About the town." Kellen paused, his hand on the door. "How much does he know?" "Enough to guess the rest, if he hasn't already," Elias said grimly. "Kellen, I think it's time, before he finds a way to use this against you, or worse, against her." Kellen's expression darkened, the warmth that usually softened his face when he thought of Mira, replaced by something harder, more protective. He wouldn't dare involve her in pack politics. Wouldn't he? Elias's voice was quiet, but firm. "You know him better than I do, in some ways. But I've watched him for years, and I don't trust the patience in his questions. He's not asking out of idle curiosity." Kellen was silent for a long moment, weighing the truth of his friend's warning against his own reluctance to disturb the fragile happiness he had built, evening by evening, in that small diner. He thought of Mira's laughter, of her hands guiding his through pie crust, of the easy way she looked at him without any awareness of the crown that shaped every other relationship in his life. He was not ready to lose that, but he understood, with growing unease, that the choice might no longer be entirely his to make. "I'll tell her," he said finally, the words heavy with a promise he was not yet certain he knew how to keep. "Soon. Before the festival, if I can manage it. Elias nodded, though the worry did not fully leave his eyes. Soon might not be soon enough, if Ronan moves first. Kellen said nothing further, but as he stepped out into the cool evening air and made his way toward the truck waiting to carry him once more to the small, warm diner that had become the one place he felt truly himself, he carried the weight of that warning with him, a quiet shadow trailing behind the light he had only recently begun to find again. The town's autumn festival arrived on a clear, crisp evening, the kind that seemed to invite everyone outdoors. Strings of golden lights hung between lampposts, the smell of roasted chestnuts and cider drifting through the square. Mira had closed the diner early to help with the food stalls, as she did every year, and had not expected Kellen to attend at all, given how carefully he seemed to guard the rest of his life outside their evenings together. She was surprised, then, and quietly delighted, when she spotted him near the edge of the square, dressed casually in a dark jacket, watching the festivities with an expression of genuine curiosity, as though he had never seen anything quite like it. "You came," she said, walking over with 2 cups of warm cider. "I did," Kellen said, accepting the cup she offered. "I wanted to see this town the way you see it, not just through the diner windows." They walked together through the square, Mira introducing him to neighbors and old friends who greeted her warmly, curious but polite about the stranger at her side. For the first time, Kellen felt something close to normalcy, walking hand in hand with someone through simple, unguarded happiness, no counsel waiting, no reports demanding his attention, no careful diplomatic mask required. It did not last. Near the far end of the square, close to where a small crowd had gathered around a musician, a young man in dark traveling clothes suddenly went rigid at the sight of Kellen, his eyes widening with immediate recognition. Before Kellen could react, the young man dropped into a low, formal bow, murmuring words that carried further than either of them intended in the sudden quiet that followed. "My king," the young scout said, still bowed low. "Forgive the intrusion. I did not expect to find you here." The words rippled outward through the nearby crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Mira felt Kellen go still beside her, his hand tightening briefly around hers, before releasing it entirely, as though bracing for something he could not yet explain. "My king?" Mira repeated slowly, looking between Kellen and the still bowed stranger, confusion giving way to a dawning, uneasy understanding. "Kellen, what is he talking about?" Kellen turned to her, his expression caught between guilt and desperation, the careful composure he wore in every other part of his life entirely absent now. "Mira, I can explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was quieter now, but sharper, cutting through the noise of the festival around them. "Kellen, who are you?" The scout, realizing too late the situation he had stumbled into, straightened and offered a hurried, awkward apology before retreating into the crowd, leaving Kellen standing alone with Mira in the sudden, uncomfortable silence that had spread through the nearby stalls. Whispers began almost immediately, townsfolk who had overheard turning to each other with wide eyes, already piecing together fragments of rumor they had heard about powerful families beyond the eastern woods, about territories governed by something other than ordinary human authority. "I am the Alpha King of the Ashwood Pack," Kellen said finally, quietly, the words landing between them with the weight of a confession long overdue. "I should have told you sooner. I wanted to. You just didn't," Mira finished, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with something closer to hurt. "For months, Kellen. Months of coffee and pie crust lessons, and you let me believe you were just a man who liked clean floors." "I was that man," Kellen said, stepping closer, though she took a small step back, putting distance between them. "I am that man. The crown doesn't change who I was with you." "Doesn't it?" Mira's eyes were bright now, glistening in the lantern light. "I don't even know what that means, Kellen. I don't know anything about your world, your pack, whatever this council is, that man just mentioned. I don't know what it means that you're some kind of king. All I know is that you let me fall for someone I only had half a picture of." The crowd around them had grown, though most kept a respectful distance, whispering among themselves, watching the unfolding scene with the particular fascination small towns reserve for genuine spectacle. Mira was acutely aware of every eye on her, of the sudden, dizzying shift in everything she thought she understood about the past several months. "I'm sorry," Kellen said, and the raw honesty in his voice was almost enough to soften her, almost enough to make her stay. "I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you'd see the crown, instead of me. That you'd treat me the way everyone else does, careful and distant, and always aware of what I represent, instead of who I am. You were the first person in years who just saw me, Mira. I didn't want to lose that." "So instead you lied," Mira said quietly, "for months." "I never lied," Kellen said. "I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing," Mira said, and though her voice was quiet now, it carried a finality that struck him harder than any shout could have. "I need to go." She turned and walked away, before he could stop her, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Kellen standing alone beneath the golden festival lights. The warmth of the evening, replaced by a hollow ache, spreading slowly through his chest. Elias appeared at his side moments later, having watched the entire scene unfold from a distance, his expression grim. "That could have gone better," Elias said quietly. "I know," Kellen said, staring at the space where Mira had disappeared into the crowd. "I should have told her sooner. I knew this was coming, and I still wasn't ready." "What now?" Elias asked. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, watching the festival continue around them, oblivious now to the drama that had briefly consumed its center. The lights still glowed warm against the darkening sky, the music still played, but the evening's earlier lightness had drained away entirely, replaced by a heavy, uncertain silence settling over him. "Now I give her space," Kellen said finally, though the words cost him more than he expected, "and then I find a way to make this right." He did not know yet how difficult that path would prove to be, or how much more complicated things would become before any chance at reconciliation arrived. But standing there in the fading festival light, watching the space where Mira had vanished into the crowd, Kellen understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever it took, however long it required, he was not willing to let this end here, not without trying everything within his power to earn back the trust he had, however unintentionally, broken. For 4 days, Mira did not see him. The diner felt strangely quiet in the evenings, the back booth empty in a way that seemed to draw her attention every time she glanced toward it, as though her eyes had simply grown used to expecting him there. She told herself it was for the best. She told herself, more than once, that a man who could hide something so significant for months was not someone she should trust with her heart, regardless of his reasons. But the ache in her chest did not seem to care much for the arguments her mind kept making. Nora, ever perceptive, noticed the change immediately. "You've been wiping that same table for 5 minutes," she said gently, on the third evening, watching Mira scrub at a spot that had long since disappeared. "Talk to me." Mira set down the rag and sighed, leaning against the counter. "He lied to me, Nora. For months. He let me believe he was just some ordinary guy who liked pie, and the whole time he was some kind of king." "Did he ever actually say he wasn't important?" Nora asked carefully. "Or did he just not mention it?" "Does it matter?" Mira said. "The result is the same. I built something with someone I didn't even know." Nora considered this for a moment before speaking again, her tone gentle but honest. "For what it's worth, from everything you've told me about him these past months, the way he talks to you, the way he listens, none of that sounds like someone playing a part. Maybe he was just a person, scared of losing something good, who made a mistake about how long to keep quiet. That doesn't erase what was real." Mira did not answer, but the words settled into her, quiet and persistent, refusing to be easily dismissed. On the 5th evening, as she was locking up the diner after closing, she found Kellen waiting outside, alone, no guards in sight, no dark truck parked nearby. He looked different somehow, stripped of whatever quiet authority had always surrounded him, even in his most casual moments. He simply looked tired, and hopeful, and uncertain, the way anyone might look, while waiting to find out if they had lost something precious. "I asked Elias to stay behind tonight," Kellen said, before she could speak. "I wanted to come alone. As myself, whatever that actually means now." Mira crossed her arms, though her voice, when she finally spoke, held less anger than it had at the festival. "Why are you here, Kellen?" "Because you deserve the truth, all of it, without an audience this time." He took a slow breath, gathering himself. "I am the Alpha King of the Ashwood Pack. My father died 2 years ago, and the crown passed to me sooner than I was ready for it. Since then, my entire life has been built around obligation. Every conversation I have carries weight. Every person I meet sees the crown before they see me. I stopped being able to tell who genuinely cared about me and who simply respected my position. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. Then I walked into your diner one rainy night, tracked mud across your floor, and you scolded me like I was nobody important at all. It was the most honest interaction I'd had in years. Mira listened, her arms slowly loosening from their defensive crossing, though she said nothing yet, letting him continue. I kept coming back because with you, I wasn't a king. I was just a man who liked pie and clean floors and, eventually, the company of someone who made me feel like myself again. I should have told you sooner. I know that. I was afraid that the moment you knew, you'd start treating me the way everyone else does, careful and distant, weighing every word. I was afraid of losing the one place in my life that felt real. He stopped, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I'm not asking you to forget that I made a mistake. I'm only asking you to believe that everything else, every conversation, every evening, every moment I spent with you, was completely real. Mira was quiet for a long moment, studying him beneath the dim glow of the street lamp, the weight of his words settling slowly into the space between them. You should have trusted me enough to tell me, she finally said, not because of who you are, because of what we were building. Trust doesn't work if it's only in one direction. You're right, Kellen said simply. I have no excuse for that, other than fear, and I understand if that isn't enough. Mira exhaled slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders easing despite herself. I don't know anything about your world, Kellen. Pacts, councils, whatever politics come with being some kind of king. I don't know if there's even a place in that world for someone like me. There's a place, Kellen said, and there was quiet certainty in his voice now, the first steady thing he had offered her all evening. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, and I won't pretend it will be simple, but I know I don't want to walk any part of it without you, if you're willing to give me the chance to be honest with you from here forward. The night air was cool around them, the town quiet and still, distant streetlights flickering gently against the dark. Mira studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation, the careful diplomacy she had feared might be hiding beneath his words, and found instead only the same tired honesty she had come to trust over months of quiet evenings together. Pie crust lessons don't count as an apology, she finally said, a faint, reluctant smile beginning to tug at the corner of her mouth. But it's a start. Relief broke across Kellen's face, unguarded and genuine, the same expression she remembered from that very first rainy night. I can offer considerably more than pie crust lessons, if given the chance. We'll see, Mira said, though the warmth had returned to her voice now, tentative, but real. Slowly, Kellen, I need to trust you again, and that's going to take more than one conversation, no matter how honest it was. I understand, Kellen said. I'm willing to earn it, however long that takes. They stood together outside the darkened diner for a while longer, talking quietly, rebuilding, piece by piece, the fragile trust that had cracked so suddenly under the festival lights. It was not a full resolution, not yet, but it was a beginning, honest in a way their earlier months together, however warm, had never quite managed to be. And as Kellen finally turned to leave that night, walking back down the quiet street toward wherever Elias waited with the truck, Mira found herself watching him go with something closer to hope than doubt settling in her chest, uncertain of what challenges still lay ahead, but willing, for the first time since the festival, to find out. News of the festival incident traveled quickly through Ashwood territory, exactly as Ronan had hoped it would. Within days, the story had spread among the pack in whispered, exaggerated versions, some claiming the king had abandoned his duties entirely for a human woman, others insisting she had somehow bewitched him, though nothing in her ordinary hard-working life gave any such rumor real foundation. Ronan did not need the rumors to be true, he only needed them to spread. The council grows uneasy, Ronan said one evening, seated across from Callum Hart, one of the older advisors whose caution made him a useful ally for Ronan's purposes, whether Callum fully realized it or not. A king distracted by personal affairs is one thing. A king whose personal affairs involve a human woman, with no understanding of pack law, no standing among our people, that is quite another. You believe she poses a genuine threat to the pack's stability? Callum asked, his brow furrowed, with the particular worry of a man who had spent decades prioritizing order above nearly everything else. I believe, Ronan said carefully, that uncertainty poses a threat, and right now, our king's judgment seems clouded by something the council does not fully understand. He let the words settle before continuing. I only wish to protect what generations before us built. Surely that concern is shared. Callum nodded slowly, already half persuaded, exactly as Ronan intended. The rumors reached the town not long after, carried by traveling merchants and border guards who mentioned, in passing conversation, the growing unease among Ashwood's council regarding their king's human companion. It did not take long for whispers to reach Mira's diner as well, townsfolk who had once simply been curious now growing wary, some customers avoiding the diner entirely out of a vague, unspoken fear of becoming entangled in matters far beyond their understanding. Then, one morning, Mira arrived to open the diner, and found the front window shattered, glass scattered across the floor she had cleaned so carefully the night before, and across the brick wall beside the door, crude words scrawled in dark paint, warning her away from matters that did not concern her kind. She stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, the cold morning air rushing past the broken glass, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and anger she had never before experienced in her quiet, ordinary life. Nora arrived minutes later, and found her still standing there, staring at the damage. "Mira," Nora breathed, hurrying to her side. "What happened?" "I don't know," Mira said quietly, though some part of her already suspected the answer had everything to do with a certain king, and the world he had recently, reluctantly, opened to her. "I need to call Kellen." When Kellen arrived, less than an hour later, having driven faster than Elias thought entirely safe, his expression darkened the moment he saw the shattered window, and the painted words still visible, despite Nora's attempt to scrub them away. "This is my fault," he said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice, as he surveyed the damage. "It's not your fault that someone did this," Mira said, though her voice trembled slightly, the shock of the morning still settling into something closer to fear. "But I won't pretend it isn't connected to whatever is happening in your world, Kellen. This is exactly what I was afraid of." "I'll find out who did this," Kellen said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "And I'll make certain it never happens again." "How?" Mira asked. "By posting guards outside my diner forever?" "Kellen, I run a business in an ordinary town. I don't know how to live surrounded by whatever politics led to this." Kellen was quiet for a moment, the weight of her fear settling over him alongside his own guilt. He understood, with painful clarity, that his presence in her life had brought danger to a doorstep that had never known any before, and the thought of that danger touching her, however indirectly, filled him with a protective fury he had rarely experienced, even in matters of pack security. "I won't let this continue," he said finally, quiet resolve replacing the anger in his voice. "I need to address this within the council directly, before rumor and fear cause more damage than words on a wall." Elias, who had arrived shortly after Kellen, and stood surveying the scene with grim understanding, spoke up carefully. "This has Ronan's influence written all over it, even if his hands are clean of the actual act. He's been stirring unease among the older council members for weeks." "Then it's time I stopped allowing him room to stir anything," Kellen said, his voice hardening with a resolve that Elias had not seen in him in quite some time. "This ends now." Mira watched the exchange with a growing understanding of just how complicated Kellen's world truly was, how far beyond quiet dinner conversations and pie crust lessons the reality of loving him would extend. Fear still lingered in her chest, sharp and unfamiliar, but beneath it, something steadier had begun to settle as well, a quiet resolve of her own, refusing to be frightened away from something she had only recently allowed herself to hope for. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, meeting Kellen's eyes. "Whatever this is, whatever danger comes with it, I'm not going to let some coward with a can of paint scare me out of my own diner." Kellen looked at her for a long moment, something between admiration and worry passing across his face. "I won't ask you to be brave alone. Whatever happens next, I intend to face it beside you, not from a distance." Together, they began the work of repairing the damage, replacing the shattered glass, painting over the crude words on the brick wall, while Elias made careful arrangements for additional security around the diner and the town, quiet enough not to draw further attention, but present enough to prevent another incident. The morning's fear slowly gave way to a fragile, determined resolve, both of them understanding now, with painful clarity, that whatever future they hoped to build together, would require far more courage than either of them had initially imagined. By evening, the diner reopened, later than usual, its window whole again, its floor once more carefully swept clean. Regular customers trickled back in slowly, some offering quiet words of support, others still uncertain how to feel about the strange new complications that had entered their quiet town's ordinary rhythm. Mira stood behind the counter, tired but unbroken, and found Kellen watching her from the back booth with the same quiet, steady devotion that had first drawn her to him, long before she had ever learned the truth of who he was. Whatever storm Ronan intended to bring, she thought, watching Kellen rise from his seat to help her stack the last of the clean dishes, she would not face it alone. And somehow, despite the fear still lingering at the edges of her thoughts, that certainty felt like more than enough to carry her through whatever difficult days still lay ahead. The following council session convened under a tension thicker than any Elias could remember in years. Word of the vandalism at Mira's diner had reached the manor, and though Ronan publicly expressed careful disapproval of the act itself, the underlying message beneath his measured words remained unmistakable. This was the natural, if regrettable, consequence of a king allowing personal attachments to compromise the pack's careful order. Kellen entered the great hall that evening with a composure Elias recognized from years past, the same steady, commanding presence his father had carried, the kind that filled a room without demanding it. Whatever uncertainty had lingered in him during his private moments with Mira, none of it showed now as he took his place at the head of the long table, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn before speaking. "I understand there has been concern among this council," Kellen began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "regarding my personal relationships and their potential impact on pack stability. I want to address that concern directly, rather than allow it to continue circulating as rumor and speculation." Ronan shifted slightly in his seat, his expression carefully neutral, though Elias caught the faint tightening around his eyes. "I have spent the past several months building a relationship with a woman named Mira Callahan," Kellen continued. "She owns a diner in the town near our eastern border. She is intelligent, hardworking, and entirely unconcerned with status or power, qualities I have found increasingly rare in my life since taking this crown." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the table once more. 2 nights ago, her business was vandalized, her window shattered, threatening words painted across her wall, an act of intimidation, clearly intended to frighten her away from her association with me. Murmurs rippled through the council, some concerned, others uncertain how to respond to such a direct address. "I will not pretend this doesn't concern me," Kellen continued, "not only for her safety, but for what it reveals about the atmosphere this council, or certain members within it, may have helped cultivate through unchecked rumor and insinuation." His eyes settled briefly, deliberately, on Ronan. "Strength, as I understand it, has always been the foundation of this pack's leadership, but I have come to believe that strength is not only measured in dominance, or bloodline, or strategic alliance. It is measured, as much as anything, in honesty, in the courage to be questioned, corrected, and still stand firm in what one believes to be right." Grace, the eldest council member, leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You believe this woman has taught you something of that strength?" "I believe," Kellen said carefully, "that she has reminded me what it looks like to live without pretense. She has never once cared what title I carry. She has only ever cared whether I was honest, whether I kept my word, whether I cleaned up my own mess when I made one." A faint, genuine smile touched his lips at the memory, quickly replaced by renewed seriousness. "I do not ask this council's permission to care for her. I am telling you plainly that I intend to continue building a life that includes her, and I expect this council, and this pack, to extend her the same respect and protection given to anyone under Ashwood's care." Ronan could no longer remain silent. "With respect, cousin, a human woman with no standing in pack law, no understanding of our traditions, cannot simply be granted protection meant for our own people, without proper consideration by this council." "She has my protection," Kellen said, his voice hardening slightly, "because I am your king, and my word carries weight in this hall, whether or not it aligns with your particular considerations, Ronan." The pointed use of his cousin's name, rather than any formal title, was not lost on the room. "If there are concerns about tradition, I welcome this council's counsel on how to address them properly. What I will not welcome is continued rumor and quiet intimidation, used as a substitute for honest discussion." The hall fell silent, the weight of the challenge settling heavily over the assembled council. Ronan's jaw tightened, though he offered a small, controlled nod, unwilling to press the matter further in such a public setting, though the calculation behind his eyes suggested the conversation was far from over as far as he was concerned. "I will take the council's questions," Kellen continued, his tone softening slightly now that his position had been made unmistakably clear, regarding how best to address the tradition and protocol surrounding this matter. "But I will not entertain further insinuation or rumor as a means of pressuring my decisions. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement passed through the room, some council members nodding with genuine respect for the directness of his address, others more reluctant but unwilling to openly challenge him further. Grace, in particular, seemed satisfied, offering Kellen a small, approving nod before the session moved on to other matters. After the council dispersed, Elias found Kellen standing alone near the tall windows of the hall, watching the darkening sky beyond. "That took considerable nerve," Elias said, coming to stand beside him. "It needed to be said," Kellen replied. "I've spent 2 years managing this council carefully, weighing every word, avoiding unnecessary conflict. But careful management is exactly what allowed Ronan the room to stir the unease that led to Mira's window being broken. I won't make that mistake again." "Ronan won't simply accept this," Elias warned. "You've challenged him publicly now. He'll look for another way to push back." "Let him try," Kellen said, though the confidence in his voice did not fully mask the concern beneath it. "I'd rather face him directly than continue allowing quiet rumor to threaten the people I care about." Elias studied his friend for a long moment, noting the steady resolve that had replaced the earlier uncertainty, the same quiet strength Kellen's father had once carried, though tempered now by something gentler, something Mira's presence had clearly helped restore. "For what it's worth," Elias said finally, "I think this is the most like yourself I've seen you in the 2 years since you took the crown." Kellen allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Then perhaps she's taught me more than pie recipes after all." Outside, the last light of evening faded over Ashwood territory, and though the council session had ended with a fragile, uneasy peace, both Kellen and Elias understood that the true test of that peace still waited somewhere ahead, in whatever move Ronan chose to make next. Ronan's patience, worn thin by the public rebuke he had suffered in the council hall, finally broke 2 weeks later. Unable to challenge Kellen directly without risking further damage to his own standing, he turned instead toward quieter, more desperate measures, reaching out to a handful of loyal followers who shared his growing frustration with what they saw as their king's reckless disregard for tradition. He told himself it was only meant to frighten her again, to send a clearer message than broken glass and painted words, something that might finally convince Mira Callahan that her place was not, and could never be, within Kellen's world. He told himself that, even as the plan he set into motion carried far greater risk than he allowed himself to fully examine. It happened on a quiet evening, nearly closing time, when Mira was alone in the diner finishing the last of her cleaning, Nora having left early for a family matter. She noticed the 2 unfamiliar men who entered just before she intended to lock the door, something immediately wrong in the careful, deliberate way they moved, nothing like the easy manner of ordinary customers. "We're closing," she said, her voice steady, despite the sudden unease tightening in her chest. "This won't take long," one of the men said, his eyes cold and unfamiliar in a way that sent a clear signal of danger through every instinct Mira possessed. She reached quietly for the phone behind the counter, but the second man moved quickly to block her path, cutting off her retreat toward the back door. What Mira did not know, in that tense, frightening moment, was that Elias, ever cautious since the vandalism, had quietly arranged for a discreet patrol to pass by the diner each evening, a precaution Kellen had insisted upon despite Mira's earlier protests about unwanted guards. That patrol, passing just outside at the critical moment, caught sight of the unfamiliar vehicle, parked awkwardly near the back entrance, and immediately radioed for backup, recognizing the signs of trouble long before Mira herself fully understood the danger she faced. Kellen received the alert within minutes, and later, Elias would say he had never seen his king move faster, abandoning the council paperwork spread across his desk without a second thought, racing toward the town with a speed that left even his most seasoned guards struggling to keep pace. Inside the diner, Mira stood her ground as best she could, refusing to let the fear controlling her racing heart show clearly on her face. "Whatever message you're trying to send," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm not leaving this diner, and I'm not leaving Kellen. You can tell whoever sent you that." The two men exchanged an uncertain glance, clearly not having anticipated such firm resistance from someone they had expected to frighten easily. Before either could decide how to respond, the diner's front door burst open, and Kellen arrived, along with 3 guards, his expression carrying a controlled fury that immediately shifted the balance of the room entirely. The two intruders, recognizing immediately that they were outmatched and thoroughly caught, offered little resistance, their earlier confidence collapsing the moment Kellen's guards moved to restrain them. Kellen crossed the room in several quick strides, reaching Mira and pulling her gently but firmly away from the confrontation, his hands checking carefully for any sign that she had been harmed. "I'm fine," Mira said quickly, though her voice trembled slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "They didn't touch me. I'm fine, Kellen." Relief flooded through him, visible in the way his shoulders finally eased, though the fury in his eyes remained as he turned toward the 2 men now firmly restrained by his guards. "Who sent you?" he demanded. Neither man answered immediately, though it did not take long, under Elias's careful and methodical questioning, for the truth to emerge. The trail led, as both Kellen and Elias had already suspected, directly back to Ronan, whose desperate attempt to remove what he saw as a threat to pack stability had instead resulted in exactly the kind of dangerous, uncontrolled situation he had always claimed to fear. Ronan was brought before the council the following morning, the evidence against him laid out clearly, and without room for the careful deflection he had relied upon so often before. Even Callum, who had once found Ronan's concerns reasonable, could not defend an act that had endangered an innocent woman's safety so directly. "You would have had this pack believe you acted only out of loyalty and tradition," Grace said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine disappointment as she addressed him before the full council. "Instead, you nearly brought real harm to someone under our king's protection, all to serve ambitions you never had the courage to name honestly." Ronan offered no real defense, his earlier confidence entirely gone now, replaced by the quiet resignation of someone who understood the consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him. Kellen, standing before the council with Mira's safety no longer in immediate danger, found himself feeling less anger now than a quiet, sorrowful understanding of how far his cousin's old resentments had carried him. "You will be stripped of your council position," Kellen said finally, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the moment. "And you will leave Ashwood territory. Until such time as this council determines, you have proven yourself capable of the trust you so clearly abused." He paused, meeting Ronan's eyes directly. "I do not do this out of anger, cousin. I do this because a leader who allows loyalty to be repaid with betrayal, however painful, cannot claim to lead with the integrity this pack deserves." Ronan said nothing further, offering only a stiff, silent nod before he was escorted from the hall, his ambitions, whatever shape they had once taken, now thoroughly and publicly ended. That evening, back at the diner, now quiet and safe once more, Mira sat across from Kellen in the same back booth where their story had first begun, the warmth of the evening settling gently around them despite the difficult events of the past weeks. "I keep thinking about that first night," Mira said softly, watching the steam rise from her coffee. "If I'd known then, everything that would follow, would I have still yelled at you about the mud?" Kellen smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I certainly hope so. It remains, to this day, the best scolding I've ever received." Mira laughed, the sound easing some of the lingering tension from the past difficult weeks. "We're going to have a lot to figure out, Kellen, your world and mine. I still don't fully understand what any of this means for me, going forward." "We'll figure it out together," Kellen said, his voice steady and certain in a way that finally, fully, put to rest the last of her earlier doubts. "Slowly, honestly, however long it takes." Outside, the town settled quietly into evening, the diner's warm lights glowing steadily against the gathering dark, a small, steady beacon that had somehow, against every unlikely odd, become the center of something far larger than either of them had ever expected when a rain-soaked stranger first tracked mud across a freshly cleaned floor. Spring arrived in Ashwood territory with a gentleness that felt, to Kellen, like a quiet reward after the difficult months that had come before. The council hall, once heavy with tension and quiet rumor, had settled into a steadier rhythm since Ronan's departure. The remaining members increasingly won over, not by decree, but by the simple, consistent evidence of their king's renewed clarity and calm. Even Callum, once cautious and uncertain, had become one of the more vocal supporters of the changes Kellen had begun introducing. Formal pathways for humans connected to the pack, through relationships or long-standing community ties, to receive recognition and protection under Ashwood law, a modernization long overdue, though it had taken recent events to finally set it in motion. Mira, for her part, had spent the winter months slowly learning the shape of the world she had stepped into, visiting the manor on occasion, meeting members of the pack who greeted her with a warmth that surprised her more each time, and gradually, carefully, building her own understanding of what it meant to stand beside someone who carried such significant responsibility. It was not always easy. There were council matters she did not fully understand, traditions that still felt foreign, moments when the weight of Kellen's position pulled him away from ordinary evenings together, for reasons of state she could only partially grasp. But there was honesty in all of it now, complete and unwavering, and that honesty had proven, again and again, to be enough. The diner itself had changed too, though its heart remained exactly as it always had. Word of the story, softened and reshaped through months of retelling, had spread beyond the town's borders, drawing curious visitors from both the human towns nearby, and, increasingly, members of the pack themselves, wolves, who had heard the tale of the woman who scolded their king about mud on her floor, and wanted, if only once, to see the place where it had all begun. Nora had taken to teasing Mira mercilessly about the diner's unexpected fame, though she managed the growing crowds with the same steady competence she brought to everything else. On a warm evening in early May, Kellen arrived at the diner just after closing, dressed more formally than his usual evening visits, a detail that did not escape Mira's notice the moment he walked through the door. "You look like you're dressed for a council meeting," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she crossed the room to greet him. "In a way, I am," Kellen admitted, a faint, nervous energy in his voice that was unusual enough to draw her full attention. "I've called a formal gathering at the manor next week, the full council, along with representatives from several neighboring packs." "That sounds important," Mira said carefully, sensing there was more he intended to say. "It is," Kellen agreed. "I intend to formally present you to the pack, Mira, not as a guest, or a curiosity, or a complication to be carefully managed, as my equal, and as someone I hope, if you're willing, to build the rest of my life alongside." Mira felt her breath catch slightly, the weight of his words settling into the quiet diner around them, the same booth where they had first shared coffee and pie, now witness to something far larger than either of them could have imagined on that rainy night, so many months ago. "Kellen," she said softly, "are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" Kellen reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, simple ring, nothing overly elaborate, chosen, he explained, because he thought she would prefer something practical and honest, over anything showy, exactly the kind of thing she had taught him to value most over the past year. "I love you," he said simply, kneeling beside the booth where they had spent countless evenings together. "Not because you accepted a crown you never asked for, but because you never let that crown matter more than honesty. You gave me back a version of myself I thought I'd lost. I would very much like to spend the rest of my life earning that gift, if you'll let me." Mira, her eyes bright with unshed tears, did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, laughing through the emotion in her voice. "Yes, of course, yes." The following week, the great hall of Ashwood Manor, filled with council members, pack representatives, and, at Mira's insistence, Nora and several of the townsfolk who had supported her through the difficult months of the past year. Kellen stood before them all, Mira at his side, and formally introduced her not merely as his companion, but as his chosen partner, the future Queen of Ashwood, a title she had once found almost unimaginable, and now accepted with a quiet, steady confidence that seemed to win over even the most hesitant members of the older council. Grace, watching the proceedings with the particular satisfaction of someone who had long hoped for exactly this kind of renewal within the pack's leadership, leaned toward Elias as the hall erupted into genuine, warm applause. "Your king found something rare," she said quietly. "He did," Elias agreed, smiling as he watched his oldest friend, standing taller and lighter than he had in years, Mira's hand steady in his own. Though I suspect he'd tell you it started with a very dirty floor. Months later, the diner reopened under new hours, busier than it had ever been. Half its regular customers now familiar faces from Ashwood territory, who came not only for the pie, though Mira's grandmother's recipe remained as beloved as ever, but for a chance to see, in person, the small, unassuming place where their king had first learned what real honesty looked like. Mira kept the back booth exactly as it had always been, a small brass plaque eventually added at Nora's insistence, marking the spot where, as the plaque simply read, everything began. Kellen visited as often as his responsibilities allowed, though now he came without hiding, greeted warmly by the same townsfolk who had once merely wondered about the quiet stranger in the corner booth. He still, on occasion, tracked in a little mud from the rain, and Mira, still, without fail, scolded him for it, though now the words carried nothing but warmth and familiar affection, a small, steady ritual between two people who had built something rare and lasting from the most unlikely of beginnings. And every time it happened, every single time, Kellen would simply smile, reach for the mop leaning against the counter exactly where it had always been kept, and clean up his own mess, grateful, in ways he never tired of expressing, for the woman who had once looked at the most powerful man in the region and, without a trace of fear, told him plainly that he had dirtied her floor.